Hello. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today with Greg Grandin to talk about his new book, America, America. And many thanks to Haymarket Live for hosting this conversation. My name is Esther Allen. I teach Latin American literature at the City University of New York, and I'm a longtime translator of Latin American writing into English. And it's my great privilege today to have the pleasure of speaking to an eminent historian, Greg Grandin, who has, I think, shaped definitely my ideas, hopefully more people's ideas about relations between the United States and Latin America through a long series of works. Most recently, prior to the book we'll be talking about, The End of the Myth, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2020, and whose most recent book, and I should have added that Greg teaches at Yale University. His most recent book is America, America, A New History of the New World. And that is what we are here to talk about today. I have some questions for Greg, myself, obviously, and I hope that all of you do too. And please feel free to put those questions in the chat as they arise. And then we'll leave time for a Q&A or maybe even work them into the conversation as we see how things shape up. Greg, thank you so much for agreeing to do this conversation with me. And let's dive right in.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to do it with me also.
Oh, it's a pleasure. So first and foremost, as we were just saying, America, America has already been on the New York Times bestseller list,
Yes.
along with a book by Pope Francis. Did you notice that Pope Francis was on the same list?
I'm sure there was a bunch of books that were in.
He was a few slots above you, but there you were with Pope Francis. And it's been reviewed widely and ecstatically. I had the pleasure of writing a review of it. And I think almost all the reviews have been just sheer encomiums. I'm wondering, first of all, what you make of the book's reception. And second of all, there was one aspect of one review that caught my attention in particular. It was a very influential review. It was the New York Times review. And the reviewer at the very end, after this rave review about the book, kind of hedged everything, kind of like stepped back and said that at the end of the day, maybe you were engaging in a little mythological thinking of your own about Latin America without anything specific, just to kind of nudge, we all know about Latin America, don't we? So tell me what's been surprising to you about the reception, what's been gratifying to you about the reception, and how you react to statements like that, assuming that there have been possibly more than that one. That just happens to be the one I'm aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think we're both based in New York, so maybe that siren will be coming by me soon. The reception has been great. I mean, in some ways, the title speaks for itself. America, America. It's almost a perfect doubling and twinning of exactly the kind of argument that I'm trying to get at. The generative tension between first British colonialism and Spanish colonialism, and then the United States and Latin America, and how it gives rise to a kind of a new political ethics. I'm rooting the beginning of what I'm calling social democratic modernity in the Americas, and in particularly in this first the critique of the conquest and the long rivalry between Latin America and the United States. But the reviews have been good, and they've because the book's pretty good, but yes, there is, in a few of the reviews, there's this kind of reluctance to kind of hold back on one aspect of the argument, and that is that there is a certain kind of depth of democratic ethos within. There's a wellspring of democracy in spirit and in action, if not always in institutional stability in Latin America. And that if you actually think about it, Latin America is one of the last continents that basically takes the Enlightenment at its word. It's to a large degree, and and I don't romanticize Latin America. I don't. I will tell you. I swear, I don't romanticize it. I don't sentimentalize Latin America, and I don't wrap Latin America up in my own in a new mythology as being a special place. The main tension of the argument is that the extreme brutality and horror generates a backlash that creates a kind of humanism that creates a kind of a more generous defense of humanity, and you can't have one without the other, right? I can't remember. I think it was I can't remember who it was who said, we fight for, we fight against dehumanization to become more human, and in the process of that, then we realize that what makes us human is that fight, and I think Latin America in some ways is exemplifies that to such an enormous degree. So I think the New York Times review was just looking for a way to end it. Even though I talked about the violence, I talked about the and what was interesting about the New York Times review is that she said for all of the to be sure caveats, and I didn't use that expression. I actually don't like that expression, to be sure. I search for it in every manuscript that I write, and I cut it out. But so there was no to be sure caveats. But it wasn't a question of like there's violence, but to be sure things there's this. It's whereas a lot of the audience, this is a Haymarket audience, probably think about socialism and think about a kind of more critical theory method. It's not that there's violence here but there's still a better thing over here. It's that the better thing over here is intricately related to the violence, and that's the short answer. There was one other book review, since you're asking about book reviews, in the New Republic. That was, it was a very Cold War kind of review. It was long and a little ponderous and wasn't critical for a long period of time until it gets to the end, where it says that a little soft on today's authoritarian leftists in Latin America, people like Maduro and Ortega. Nowhere do I celebrate Nicolas Maduro or Ortega. I say what happened to their countries could be explained historically. But what's fascinating about that, so that criticism kind of took me to task for being, a little soft on authoritarianism when it's of the left. But of course, like, first of all, the whole book, Vargas, FDR during the good neighbor policy was soft on authoritarianism of the left because he saw them as building out a social state. And also, this is a book that kind of rehabilitates the Catholic Church to some degree. And like, when we're talking about the evils committed in the world, can Chavez or Ortega or Maduro throw them all in together compared to the Sidney Hook called the Catholic Church the greatest totalitarian organization in history. And the book also rehabilitates in its own way Woodrow Wilson. So there's no criticism of that, or even the irony of but we're gonna latch on that. Anyway, that's my little. We shouldn't really start the thing with
well, I just wanted
to the minor critiques that I'm going to complain about.
It's just fascinating to me how discussions of this particular regional, it's one region of the world, it's relations between two parts of it, always devolve into like inferiority, superiority, right? Like you're more brutal, or no, you're more brutal, or no, yeah. And I think you can talk about two countries within the context of European history, or or other countries, without going like, you're the really bad one, and we retain. And so somehow that always seems to infiltrate discussions of the United States and Latin America in
Yeah, and
ways
it's
that are.
different types of brutality, different types of corruption. As historians, we need to kind of look at it dispassionately, while at the same time, I think that working within a normative framework of what we think is right and wrong, and the fact that despite all of the terror, that when you think about all of the terror that has been unleashed on Latin America, if we just want to take the Cold War period, on frontline defenders of what we call social democracy or democracy, whatever you want to call it, from more radical groups like the Brazil's landless workers, to to environmentalists, to feminists, to trans rights activists, and all of that violence and all of that terror, and yet Latin America still hasn't kind of crumbled into a kind of nasty nationalism, or or ethno hatred. To a large degree, indigenous rights movements are the best bearers of a kind of a universalist social democracy, an inclusive social democracy, an intersectional social democracy. So to point that out is and to say that this is unique, and this needs to be accounted for historically, and that ultimately is what the point of the book is. It starts with the conquest, and it comes up to the present, and there's a lot of stuff in it, and it looks at that tension. The very first line of the first chapter is, philosophy, Socrates. Well, it's debated whether Aristotle or Socrates said it, but uh, um, I'm sorry whether Plato or Socrates said it, but philosophy begins in wonder and matures, Hegel added, on the slaughter bench of history. And that basically is the motto of the book in some ways, and the method of the book.
It's just very interesting to me that people here, critics here, even still retain this notion, even now, right? So my second question takes us to the slaughter bench of history. In your account of the Spanish conquest, which is extraordinary, you describe what Las Casas witnessed as a new kind of mass murder carried out with a new kind of cruelty. And you quote Svetan Todorov, the Bulgarian French critic, who called the conquest the greatest genocide in human history. So you use the word, but only quoting it from somebody else. You also describe, I think this is absolutely brilliant, how the English, in their genocidal treatment of the Irish during the century that followed Columbus, evoked the Spanish conquest as a kind of rationale for their brutality. In other words, they were punishing the Irish for what the Spanish did to the Indian. That's like just one of the craziest twists in the whole book, that insane logic literally invoked by the English. And you also point out that Hitler, in his genocidal quest for Lebensraum, turns to U.S. expansion and Indian removal as a model. And you cite several authoritative books about that. It's not really in question. And I just wonder, is America America in some tacit way, America America? I, of all people, should make sure to pronounce the second word correctly. Does America America suggest that genocide is somehow a product of the New World?
I don't know that much about earlier phases of world history to say that, to talk, and of course genocide, as we discussed, is a new coinage, after World War II, to deal with the reality and horror of the Holocaust. And so, I mean, certainly there was the Europe preceding the what's interesting about Las Casas' remarks, he emerged from a Europe that was in the middle of a century and a half of enormous violence, intense violence. I don't know if you'd call it genocidal, because it was among Europeans. I don't know if what the Romans carried out against the so-called barbarians, any given group of barbarians, would be called genocide. I mean, I try to avoid, arguments about naming things. The modern word genocide contains within its definition the quality of dissent. I mean, not dissent, intent, that they had to intend to destroy in whole or in part. Now, there is no doubt that Spanish America wanted Native Americans for labor. That they did not want to exterminate all of the Indians, even though what actually happened, just to give you is a sense of the scale of the horror, is that demographers believe that maybe there was 100 million people living in the Americas around the time of Columbus's arrival, of de las Casas' arrival, and within a century, about 90% of them were gone. The first wave was due to genocidal terror, conquest terror. The subjugation of Native Americans, the forcing them to pay tribute, the forcing them to find gold and silver and other resources, to dive for pearls in the Caribbean, and the dislocations that came from that led to an immediate collapse, first in the Caribbean, and then as the Spanish Empire spread out into Mexico and then the Andes, there was more fighting and more bloodshed and more terror, and Cortez's campaign in Mexico was brutal, and it was complicated. He had support by allied indigenous groups that didn't want to be subjugated to the Aztecs, so it's not a clear case. But ultimately there is a larger history and hierarchy of power at play. I focus on that horror to focus on the backlash to that horror, and how it creates within the Catholic Church a kind of, among some people in the Catholic Church, such as you mentioned Bartolomé de las Casas, and for those who don't know, he arrived in Hispaniola, the island that now contains the Dominican Republic and Haiti, in about 1503. He was already a priest. He was going to be a settler merchant. His father sailed with Columbus, and he had no particular, ethical concerns. But after being on the island for for maybe a decade, he had a call to conscience, and he realized that what was going on was just the atrocity was indescribable, and he wrote letter, wrote an unbelievable amount of in Latin and Spanish, about the atrocities, about the New World. He believed that more people lived in the New World than lived in all of the Old World. He was mistaken about that. But the Spanish realized that there existed an enormous amount of people. I don't believe the majority of Spanish conquistadors, not maybe the frontline conquistadors, but certainly the Spanish colonial state didn't intend to destroy them, because they needed them for their labor. And that's what's key to one of the arguments, is that Spanish colonialism, Spanish Catholic colonialism, understood itself as universal, as the bearer of all the world's history and all that history's wisdom. And the coming to terms with the reality that there existed half a world with an untold millions of people was a challenge to that universalism. It made people realize that what they thought was universal was but parochial, and that the ancients really didn't know anything. And all of their justifications for slavery, particularly justifications for natural slavery, that the idea that there was a race of lesser humans that could justify slavery, this was according to de las Casas, was wrong. And Las Casas put forward this very formidable ideological attack on the very foundations of conquest. He's known now mostly as a protector of Indians and a defender of Indians who would use whatever he could to help the lot of Indians. But he was actually quite much more ideologically sophisticated than that. It is true, he did whatever he could, and whether it was contradictory or not, in order to defend Indians. But he had a vision of the New World. His vision of the New World really began to challenge some fundamental premises. Him and other Dominicans like him One, he said that the New World convinced him that all people were one, that all people descended from Adam and Eve. They all had the same capacities as human beings, and therefore they all came from the same lineages. They laughed when they were happy. They wailed when their family was killed by the Spaniards. They could hold property. They could organize themselves in communities with leaders. All of the things that they were gente. They lived in society, and he used the word gente, a Spanish word, a Latin word that means people. They lived in society, and others questioned the validity of the conquest. Others questioned the legitimacy of waging war, narrowed the criteria by which a just war could be fought. So all of this kind of moral questioning and challenging of the conquest early on, of the genocide of the conquest, really becomes, it's ineffectual in the short run. It doesn't do much to alleviate or slow down the conquest. But the argument is that it has long term effects.
Well, and I think another of the really compelling points that you make in the book is that in the United States, this tremendous moral issue that galvanizes the Spanish-speaking world and that remains really central in the whole history of Latin America, just kind of doesn't develop, except for a few fringe figures that never really introduce the dilemma into any sort of mainstream problematic.
Yeah, and as I said, the book is a contrast of Spanish Spanish and English colonialism, and and I mean a lot of things come together to create this contrast. A lot of variables, the nature of the where the Spaniards landed in the New World, that was dense with people, that was rich in resources, that with a sedentary people that they couldn't mobilize, no, even despite the collapse of population, and that would become central to the empire. Native Americans and then African Americans were the main thing in the Spanish American Empire. They were the extractors of New World's resources back to Europe. The world's first universal currency coming from the mines of Potosi and other mines, the silver. But they were also the moral center of Spanish colonialism. These ongoing debates about the nature of Native Americans and where they stood in God's earthly estate. Now, the British, for the most part, with jumping over a lot of history, including the prelude of the Irish genocide, which you touched on earlier, which is a big part of the book. And I never really get a chance to talk too much about it, but it is for those who buy the book, it is an interesting part of the book. But they are, once the Irish are conquered and subordinated, in many ways, that's a continuation of British settlement in North America. So in some ways, you have the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Islam being the prelude to the conquest of the Americas. You have the conquest of Ireland for English Anglo-Saxons being the prelude for the conquest of North America. But it happened over a century after, Plymouth colony is in the Mayflower shows up in 1821. John Smith sails a little bit earlier than that into the Chesapeake. And the British have a long time to consider whether they're watching the thing. This is the other thing, is that they're watching these Spanish debates that take place mostly at the University of Salamanca, and hence it becomes known as the Salamanca School. And there's a great document that I use in the book from 1807, 1808, where the Virginia Planting Company is sitting around, the board of directors are sitting around just wondering if they should put out some statement to justify why they're settling North America, whether they're going to bring Christ to the heathens or whatever. And they have a long debate, and the whole debate is all in reference to the debate that went on in Spain. De las Casas, Francisco Vitoria, Pedro Molina, Francisco Suarez, all of these Dominican and Franciscan and Jesuit jurists and theologians, and the English basically said, the Spaniards have been arguing about this for a century, and they can't justify conquest, much less enslavement. So maybe it's better we don't say anything. and just we'll just be quiet and just quietly settle North America. And that's kind of what they do. But it's also 100 years later, and it's a different demography in North America, and a demography that is already, as a prelude, wiped out by European diseases. Right. So the people from the Mayflower who are in bad shape themselves, I mean, they tumble off the Mayflower, they start digging up Indian graves looking for buried corn because they're starving. There's no evidence that they engaged in survival cannibalism like had happened earlier at Jamestown, but they were digging up graves looking for buried corn that Native Americans planted with them. But they also looked around and they couldn't find anybody,
right?
because the advanced diseases had wiped out 90% of the eastern indigenous population, all the native population around Massachusetts up until Maine, and they were like, "Oh, look,
hand of God,
look at this, how great!" And then a mythology arises, ex post facto, of that God had cleared the land to make way for His people. So, and I don't want to downplay things like the fur trade and ways in which indigenous people were enslaved and put to labor, but obviously it was on a different scale than what the Spaniards were doing. So Native Americans were not the main thing for the English people. They, in fact, they could deny and invade and push out, and that kind of tension between a Spanish political, theological culture that couldn't stop talking about the nature of Native Americans and building an extractive empire that couldn't stop talking about Native Americans, and an Anglo empire that at first, I mean, a lot of them, like James Smith, wanted to be Cortez. He was hoping to find a large sedentary population in Chesapeake with large mines and preside over an extractive empire just like Cortez, but there wasn't. I mean, I think there's some Native Americans told John Smith that there's a big mine on Martha's Vineyard. And they sent him up to Martha's Vineyard.
Get rid of him, right?
Exploring Martha's Vineyard, looking for a mine. He couldn't find a mine. He couldn't find a gold mine on Martha's Vineyard. So, there was ways in which the ideological context and the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism merges with the demographic reality of the different places they landed and the different times they landed, and to create this distinction in the way Spanish Catholicism, Spanish colonialism, and English colonialism proceeded. And I do trace out that there was an invasion built into the English model from the beginning, that we're going to push difference, namely Native Americans, to the frontier, and they're not going to be part of the colonial project in any degree, or they can imagine it as not being part. Where the Spaniards, it was the opposite. And it's that incorporation for all of its brutality, for all of its exploitation. I locate the origins of the social democratic, the social democratic modernity, because the independence leaders who seek to break away from Spain, there's two things. One, they inherit a very powerful moral critique against Spain, and they see independence from Spain as an atonement for the conquest. And they come up, there's a lot of independent leaders who talk about the conquistadors. They were the ones who were subhuman. They came here stripped of any kind of moral oversight and ravaged through Native Americans and destroyed them. And independence is a form of atonement. Now, of course, they too were hypocritical, because Native Americans didn't get a hell of a lot out of independence, but at least there's still this grappling with it, right? Grappling with questions of land, grappling with questions with resources. Whereas North American independence, which happened earlier than Spanish America, 1776. They didn't see anything wrong with the first settlement, with the first conquest. The colonialists did nothing wrong. The colonial state did nothing wrong. All the grievances were placed at the feet of King George. John Adams said the United States didn't conquer America; it settled America. And the doctrine of a kind of empty land, an empty land, doctrine of discovery of empty land, underwrote a lot of their justification for taking over land.
I think there's another difference also that you allude to, which is the gender thing. The Spaniards are all men. They arrive as warriors. There's no women on those boats. The Mayflower, it's families. They arrive. They have no need for native women for any reason. They have their own women. And so you develop these parallel, it's taken the United States many, many, many centuries to reach a much more tolerant attitude towards racial mingling that exists in the Spanish Empire from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So
and
ideally, cultural difference.
Ideally, the Spanish crown imagined the New World set up on very Aristotelian symmetrical, kind of symmetrical lines. Where there's a Republic of Indios and a Republic of Españoles, and they went about their business, and each one owed the other obligations. But of course, between rape, between consensual sex, between soon that breaks down. There's no containing two separate pure republics of Indians, and of course, because it's Spain, and Spain is the most bureaucratic empire in the world, and everything has to be classified and put a name on, right? So I have this all in the book, and I wish I all my copies of my book are upstairs, but yes. So they create ever more new categories to name mixtures of, the mother was an Indian, the father was a Spanish, but then the grand. So it was like a Borgesian, museum of ever greater classifications, and the thing is, it couldn't go on forever, and eventually, obviously, it didn't. It collapsed under its own weight. But the idea is that there was a recognition that the Spanish Empire was a universal empire. It believed itself to embody universal truths, but it administered an empire that was organized around the recognition of difference, and that, I think, is the fundamental difference.
I think you quote Octavio Paz, who says, if you're looking at the Casta painting, it's very clear that the people who have more European blood and lighter skin are more wealthy, have, might have servants around them, or wearing more elaborate clothes. So there's a very clear economic distinction between them and the people with the darker skin, the more indigenous features, the more African features. But no one is a pariah. Yeah. Everybody has their little square within the Pintura de Castas, within this diagram of society. Everyone has their place.
Yeah, right.
And Paz draws a difference between that and the evolution of race relations within the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I qualify that a bit. I mean, if Jews were obviously expelled and Muslims were prohibited from coming, and if you were a woman who was pursued by the Inquisition for being a witch, and I focus on one story in particular, that in which the political content of Bartolomé de las Casas's critique gets sublimated into a more ecstatic vision of like a kind of sexual utopia. And there's one, and after his death, and Las Casas's vision is suppressed, it kind of it emerges in other places, including the appearance of kind of mystical communities, many of them organized around what the flesh desires, and so those people who were hounded by the Inquisition might disagree with Paz that there was no such thing as a pariah, but I do think he was getting at something, that there was a place for everything, and it's a unity. It's and there's a deep sociality in Spanish America that comes out of the colony and comes out of the intellectual debates, a kind of viscous social relations of obligations. And this is apparent in a lot of the early constitutions of Spanish America, which protected individual rights, just like the U.S. Constitution did. They were very prescriptive. The state shall not. The state shall not. They were mosaic in its prescriptions, and all of the same palette of rights that the U.S. Constitution granted, to assemble, to believe, to speak, to move. I don't think there were many. I don't think they mentioned anything about guns, but in general, the idea that it's a state's responsibility to restrain itself and allow the greatest individual area of freedom for particular people. But it also said that there's no such thing as individuals without society. That society made individuals possible. And this is deep in Spanish Catholicism, Spanish political culture, and a certain kind of both Spanish. It's deep both in Spanish republicanism and Spanish Catholicism. That you can only have individuality and individual rights if you have society, that one balances the other. And a lot of these constitution writers, they look back to the conquest, and they pointed out to the conquistadors who, where back then all of the defenders of the conquest were saying it was the Indians, the Native Americans who weren't human. These Spanish Constitution writers said no, it was the conquistadors that dehumanized themselves by acting by coming over like ferocious animals to terrorize a population. And the constitutions tried to reflect this balance. They believed that there was a greater good that transcended the individual sums of the pursuit of individual interests. Now, if you looked at the U.S. Constitution, except for one vague reference to the general welfare, it's completely prescriptive. It's all about individual rights. It's all about containing the state to allow a greater room of individual rights. There's no place in which the state is supposed to not just stand back but act out. And from the very first Spanish American Constitution in 1812 in Venezuela, there was you could see the rudiments of social democracy, the idea that it wasn't just the state's responsibility to step back, but it was an obligation to act, to create society, to provide education, to provide healthcare, and the rudiments of what they thought was a virtuous state.
I want to turn to another question that's something I've been grappling with. I'm sure we're both huge fans of Ada Ferrer, your former colleague at NYU.
Yeah.
And in her book, Cuba and American History, she talks about the kind of U.S. historiography that made Columbus and 1492 the starting point of U.S. history, which might be one of the reasons why you kind of like Columbus is just not here, right?
Well, yeah.
You chose not to deal too much with him. And what Ada writes is that U.S. historians essentially seized on a foreign history to make it theirs when they make Columbus the starting point, and that this was sort of part and parcel of U.S. territorial expansionist ambitions, right? That what Columbus discovered was what would be, all the United States of America. And so this is just an example of how connecting U.S. and Latin American history can be very, very tricky, and can be done in all kinds of ways that don't necessarily serve, what we want to serve. And you offer a powerfully compelling argument that the longstanding disconnect between these histories, the ways in which they're always told separately, they seem to exist in two different realms. For many people, much more so in the United States, I think, than in Latin America. And I agree with that argument, but it's extremely difficult to write against the powerfully centrifugal U.S. narrative of itself while writing for audiences in the U.S. And how did you negotiate that difficulty, and what were the challenges of it, and what reactions have you had from Latin Americans, specifically from Latin Americans, both within and outside the United States?
Yeah. Well, the book just came out, so the reactions are still coming in. I haven't,
Early reactions.
scholarly reactions take a little bit. They follow a different timeline.
Yes.
I haven't heard the scholarly reactions yet. But aside from a few, but I guess what I was doing, it's a fairly kind of, I'm it's a narrative. It's a narrative that starts with the conquest and it ends with the present in some ways. But it's an argument that's embedded in the narrative. And the narrative is that there's this imminent critique, to borrow a Frankfurt School concept, in which the tension in which that Latin Americans understood the New World to be as providential, as redemptive, as a chance to create the world anew, as did the United States. That you can't understand American exceptionalism without understanding that word America in its fullest content, because Spanish Americans and Latin Americans and Portuguese speaking Americans likewise believed in that the New World represented a place to remake the world anew. And the argument is it plays out on many different levels. And my editor always tells me I talk on too abstract a level, that I don't bring in the people and the stories. Let me just tell the audience that there's a lot of stories in the book, and there's a lot of people in the book, and they're all fascinating, and we can get into people and the stories. But and my editor says I should stop talking about the abstract arguments. But the arguments are basically, the United States comes into being in the world a single nation on what its leaders imagined was an empty or empty enough continent. Of course it wasn't, but there was little doubt that America, which at the time meant they called their country America, but they imagined the continent America, that soon there'd be a convergence and America would encompass the continent. And as such, they revitalized the doctrine of conquest. The doctrine of conquest that had been criticized by the Salamanca school, that had been criticized by Spanish Americans. And there was, doctrine of conquest was taught in the United States through the 1920s as a legitimate doctrine, that you could wage war on your neighbor for whatever reason, and if you won, you legitimately had that land and that territory. Latin America was different. Latin America came into the world already a community of nations, 7 independent republics plus Brazil, which has a complicated history. It remained a monarchy because the Brazilian crown fled Napoleon's Portugal and set up its court in Rio, but declared independence. So there was 7 republics and 1 monarchy, and they didn't imagine their continent as empty, even though even though there was plenty of places where states didn't maintain administrative legitimacy or hegemony or authority, but they believed themselves to be occupying a fold-up continent. And so they all were already a league of nations. They were already a united nation. They were sister republics and 1 monarchy that had to learn how to live with each other. They had to learn how to live with each other because they both individually legitimated the other, because you could show that you could rise up and overthrow Europe and Catholicism and create independent states, and it was legitimate. But under the old rules of law, they threatened each other, because under the old rules of law, what was to stop Argentina from saying, "Hey, we're going to use the United States' doctrine of sovereignty, which is the doctrine of conquest, and like, we want the Pacific too, so we're just going to go take Chile." They could have done that, but they were also understood themselves as part of a common national family. So really the foundations of international law as we know it that gets put into place after World War II, it's all present in the early years of Spanish independence, the rejection of aggressive war, the respect of boundaries, the respect of national sovereignty, the idea that the international community has to be organized around something other than a balance of power or a competition of power, and the premise that cooperation, that there were shared interests, and cooperation should be the foundational principle on which an international order is founded, all comes out of Latin America. And that is what is put into place in after World War II in the United States, in the world, in San Francisco with the United Nations, and also with the League of Nations. But that was a failure. So that's the narrative, right? That's the story to some degree, and also Latin American independence leaders, when they were facing an aggrandizing the United States, moving across the continent, taking Mexican land, taking Spanish land, taking indigenous land, moving across like a whirligig, they had at their disposal a whole intellectual tradition in which to critique this. And that was the tradition that was used to critique Spain. 300 years earlier, America had developed a deep anti-imperialist tradition because they had the intellectual tools. And so in many ways, that's the narrative that I trace out through these stories, and then there's moments of convergence during World War II and pre-World War II, where Latin America and the United States come together in a kind of continental New Deal, and then and become a kind of an anti-fascist bastion. So I spent a lot of time on the ways in which the good neighbor policy and Latin and Spanish America become a kind of model for what the world should be once the war was over.
It's fascinating to look at this period in the first half of the 20th century that you sort of tease out as being the moment when the US actually was learning something from Latin America. Woodrow Wilson, the Mexican Revolution, FDR, the Office of Inter-American Affairs during World War II that coordinates all of these resources, which you argue very compellingly are what makes the victory of the Allies possible, that there were all of these things that were required for Latin America, that working as a unit, the Americas managed to supply. And yet at the same time, domestically within the United States, this is a terrible time to be Hispanic, right? I mean, in terms of the forced sterilizations of Puerto Ricans and lynchings and land expropriations. And it's a terrible time to be other. It's a terrible time to be Japanese. It's also a terrible time to be Hispanic. So there's a kind of strange between this international success story of cooperation, mutual cooperation, and what's happening to people of Latin American ancestry within the United States. There's this real divide.
Yeah, there is. I mean, like everything else, like the tension between the ideal and the real is enormous, and the gap between the ideal and the real is enormous. And hypocrisy, I think, is a very useful historical category of analysis. The gap between what I say and what I do. It creates possibilities, and it creates the configurations of what political action could take. But yes, there was still a lot of but the Roosevelt administration really did also at the same time try to put forward a cultural pluralism more than any of his predecessors, without any doubt. I spent a good deal of this in Roosevelt's first re-election, 1930. He's elected in 32. He's inaugurated in 33, and he's re-elected in 1936. And it's in 1933 when Latin America finally convinces the United States to give up the doctrine of conquest. Finally, so in some ways, this is a book about the the progress and the rise and fall, and then now rise again of the doctrine of conquest. But there's an international conference in Montevideo in 1933, and Roosevelt sends Cordell Hull as Secretary of State, who's kind of a right wing New Dealer. He's okay, but he's also a free trader. And Roosevelt had two failed international conferences in Europe by this point. In the middle of 1933, his first year as president, and he tells Hull, go to Montevideo. There's this regularly scheduled Pan American conference, and don't make any real promises. You can give them some, money for build highways. You can give them some, lights so they can land planes at night. But don't give in to any of them big ideals about American international law or all of the stuff that they've been pushing on us for the last 50 years. And Hull goes down there, but he also brings a radical with him, because things were looser at the time. The delegations were smaller. Ernest Gruning this is one of the stories that my editor wants me to tell. One of this is like fleshing out the abstractions. Ernest Gruning was the editor of The Nation. He was a big anti-imperialist, and he worked a lot on Haiti. He was Jewish American, New Yorker. His sisters were radicals. They hung out with W.E.B. Du Bois. They published newspapers. They were part of that whole social milieu of radicalism, Red New York. And Gruning was particularly concerned with the U.S. occupation of Haiti, which he compared to the Belgian occupation of King Leopold in the Congo, and he got selected to be on this delegation, and he buttonholed Hull, and he said, "Listen, you've got to accept Latin America's demand, one, to give up the right of intervention, and two, to recognize the absolute sovereignty of all nations, big or small, in their internal and external affairs." And Hull hemmed and hawed. He said, "Oh, the Hearst papers will kill us. We'll still have to be reelected. What am I going to, So, but Hull was a free trader, and he began to see in his mind a kind of conception in which non-intervention kind of corresponded with a kind of vision of free trade, which wasn't getting a lot of play in the New Deal, in the early New Deal. So he went down to Montevideo and he basically capitulated. He said yes to everything. He said, yes, no, we're not going to intervene anymore. We forswear the right of intervention. Yes, we recognize the sovereignty of it. It was the most successful foreign policy change in U.S. history. And basically what it did was it saved the New Deal. It allowed for the consolidation. Hull went back to the United States. He was afraid Roosevelt was going to be annoyed, but Roosevelt was pretty smart. He was pretty quick on his feet, and he saw the goodwill that was generated. And he got Congress to pass a law that talking about tariffs, he got Congress to pass a law to give Hull the ability to lower tariffs on any nation. So he immediately signed all these treaties that benefited U.S. corporations that weren't so labor intensive, that wanted open markets. So it diluted opposition to FDR within the United States, and because they were giving them open markets in Latin America and elsewhere. And so this was the good neighbor policy, but we all know of the good neighbor policy as a foreign policy, thing having to do with Latin America. But Roosevelt's this is where I'm circling around to the hypocrisy and the bad treatment of Japanese Americans and Native and Latinos in the United States. The phrase "good neighbor" was also used for Roosevelt's "Get Out the Vote" campaign in 1936, and it became one of those political phrases that captured a certain common sense. That there's a new way of thinking about the world in which nations are equal, and there's a new way of thinking about our country in which we're accepting cultural pluralism. And good neighbor leagues sprouted up everywhere, and they were explicitly set up as alternatives to the Liberty Leagues, which were kind of seedbeds of proto-fascism, of a Saxon fascism, white supremacy, a kind of angry, thing. So, and the Good Neighbor Leagues was set up explicitly to counter that. And they became the get out the vote mechanisms for African Americans in the South, for Chicanos in the Southeast, for Native Americans, for white ethnics, Italians and Irish, and in the cities, and it was unbelievably successful in a way of articulating this new ethos of both cultural pluralism and acceptance and social citizenship and a new reformed foreign policy. Roosevelt won that re-election despite that was a very dangerous time where fascists, with extremists were on the rise. Hull's free trade treaty won back a lot of businesses, and FDR was able to pass the National Labor Relations Act, and Roosevelt won that election with 27 million votes. There was more votes in 1936 than any other human being up to the time ever won anywhere, and he won it on largely a social democratic platform. Now, I'm not downplaying, on the ground there was still a lot, soon when the war started, Japanese Americans would be stripped of their rights, and interned, Latino migrants, under Roosevelt, the I can't remember when the Department of Labor, the Border Patrol was still under the Department of Labor, which meant it was under Frances Perkins, who was a fairly progressive leader. And she tried to clamp down on some of the abuse by the Border Patrol. At the same time, of course, all of that stuff continued. But the fact that this kind of cultural pluralism that Roosevelt called it your Americanism and mine, instead of this Anglo-Saxon supremacy, emerges out of Latin America, both in terms of foreign policy and both in terms of the way they imagine this get out the vote. And what's the first thing Roosevelt does in 1936 after it wins election? Wins this landslide election, 27 million votes. The very first thing he does is he sails to Rio de Janeiro and then Buenos Aires, and he begins to organize the continent for World War, to prepare for anti-fascism. And he signals to the Democrats and to the leftists, and even to people like Vargas, who was a dictator, but he was a dictator building out the social state. He was repressing communists, but he was also repressing Nazism as he was reigning in the landlords and the feudal barons and extending rights to workers. So Roosevelt would ally with him. So he signaled to these people that there's an alternative to fascism, because there was a real fear that Latin America, there's a real fear by geostrategists that Latin America could be the Spanish-American War writ large. It had all the same variables, right? A manorial class, a strong conservative Catholic tradition, Praetorians, that Franco was really just a foreshadow of what would happen in all of the Americas, that a right-wing Catholic.
You mean the Spanish Civil War, not the Spanish-American War?
Yes, the Spanish Civil War.
I was confused.
And that didn't happen, right? Latin America didn't fall to a continental Franco. It became, it lined up behind the United States, and that's an important part of the book.
Well, here's something very specific for Sarah, if she's listening. The Avenue of the Americas, which goes right past my house, is called the Avenue of the Americas in celebration, right, of this great hemispheric success. And the city just refurbished all of those medallions that hang along it, right?
That was the Nelson Rockefeller initiative.
Right, exactly, who had been the head of the Inter-American Affairs. So this was acknowledged and registered. And New York is not the only city that has an Avenue of the Americas. Like, people within the United States understood how beneficial this cooperation and collaboration and alliance had been to them. in palpable ways that are still reflected in cityscapes, right?
Yeah.
And yet, and yet, and yet.
And yet, yeah, and so you can mark the turning point. Henry Wallace goes to Latin America in 1943. He's the vice president of Roosevelt during his third administration. Everybody thinks Roosevelt's not going to run for a fourth term, and Henry Wallace is going to be the president. I mean, people in Latin America are calling him Señor Presidente because they think that he's going to be the next president. Henry Wallace is the head of the Bureau of Economic Warfare, which is this enormous bureaucratic apparatus meant to mobilize Latin American resources. Wallace insists that there's a labor clause, because Wallace had this vision of fascism that was very kind of analytical. He said that we could beat fascism on the battlefield, but if we don't raise the world's standards of living, fascism will continue to reappear in different forms. I mean, he was very clear about it, that fascism was not going to be beat on the battlefields. It was going to be beat by the paychecks. And he put in all of the clauses of the procurement clauses in which that they get in the tin from Bolivia and the rubber from Brazil, that they have to pay a certain living wage, a decent wage. They had to provide health care. They had to allow for unions. They had all of this stuff. And the right in the United States begins to mobilize against Wallace around this time, because it's around 1943 that the war starts to shift, right? Russia breaks the siege of Stalingrad, starts moving, it starts defeating the Weimar, and the United States starts to go on the offensive in the Pacific, and there's a sense that the winds of war are changing, and friend Wallace is, we have to contain him. I mean, Wallace is in Chile giving speeches to communists, to tens of thousands of communists in the mining town of Lota, telling them that they're the front lines of democracy, and promising them that after the war, we are going to fund development, and we're going to fund comprehensive development in value-added industries, not just in mines and not just in fields, but we're going to help you make things so you can get paid better. I mean, you capture that surplus labor and spend it in the form of a social wage and education. And Wallace toured Latin America as if he was, I mean, people said they never saw anything like it before. And it freaked. I mean, one of the arguments of the book is that tour of Wallace at 43 really freaked out his enemies at home, and they began to mobilize. And that was the beginning of the purging of the left within the New Deal. And the first, I also talk about how we all know the second Red Scare goes after, the McCarthyism, and they go after the State Department, but they really go after the people who work on the Latin Americanist desk, because they think of the conservatives and anti-communists within the New Deal coalition think of all of Latin America as one giant popular front. I mean, that's basically a front for the Soviet Union. And so they start purging them from the Bureau of Economic Warfare. They start purging them from the State Department. They start going after these cultural programs that were, same kind of stuff that we're seeing today, the Department of Interior or the Department of Rockefeller's organization would fund all sorts of cultural exchanges, and communists in Mexico are getting money to paint murals, and left-wing anthropologists from New York are going down to Brazil to study Afro-Brazilian culture, and there's also it's basically it brings it all together in the minds of the sex, the race, the class, the economic hierarchy, challenges economic hierarchy, and they really go after a lot of the Latin Americanists first. That's the kind of prelude to the second Red Scare that's more famous in some ways. And of course, Wallace is off the ticket in 44, and Roosevelt dies, and Truman is president, and Latin America is still held up, constantly held up. The idea of like U.S. diplomats and politicians would, from the late 30s onward up until 45 would hold up Latin America as a model for what the world should look like after we defeat Nazism. And Truman and his gangs still do that, but it becomes an abstraction. Latin America itself falls behind, right? Like the people who fight World War II are more impressed by, you know, developing power of scale, of logistics, of, it's not the miners in Lota, communists that are going to win the war. It's being able to mobilize a vast national security apparatus. And these are people who have no love for Latin America, and no, Atchison and Forrestal and the people who lay the groundwork for the Cold War. They might continue to just hold up Latin America as a model of a peaceful community of nations, but it becomes an abstraction. And then of course the U.S. switches from supporting the left in Latin America against the right to very quickly supporting the right against the left, and without having a Marshall Plan in Latin America. To the left is everybody. It's not just communists aligned with the Soviet Union in communist parties, but social democrats and Christian democrats and any kind of economic nationalism, because Latin America has to attract private capital in order to develop, because there's no Marshall Plan.
You do this really interesting thing in the book. I'm not quite sure how you did it, which is that you don't mention the present that much. In the last chapter, a little bit, you talk about the present moment, but you very much write into the present, so that you don't need to make the connections, but the reader is constantly making these connections to the present moment. And recently you kind of expanded on that in a piece that you wrote for Tom Dispatch, I think last week, where you very explicitly connected Latin America and the Middle East, and what you describe in your book, and the conquest by Spain specifically, with what's happening in Gaza right now. I think somebody pointed out, and I was really amazed to see this, that the end of the myth also mentioned Gaza in this extraordinary way, where you quote one of the Minutemen, one of these vigilante groups along the border, who, this is probably 8-10 years ago, describes the borderlands as our Gaza, right? Yeah. And that's in the end of the myth. So in this piece that you just wrote in Tom's Dispatch, which everybody who's watching should immediately go and find and read, you say that you find these uncanny parallels between the conquest and what we're seeing in Gaza, and specifically with regard to communications. And it's funny because as you tell it, Las Casas almost has the role of, say, we might imagine a contemporary journalist to have, right? To raise consciousness by revealing atrocities that will cause revulsion and then prevent further atrocity, right? Ethical backlash, you call it. And I think one of the really, and perhaps this is a mechanism that hasn't worked for a long time. The idea that we could still provoke ethical backlash, the idea that things could still be stopped, right, by journalists who prove to us what is really happening. But in this, is this shared humanity premise, that we've all been operating on since Las Casas? It almost feels like that's not valid anymore. Is this revived age of conquest, going to have to find a new model? What other model is there?
Well, that is still Latin America. It's hold on to a
Latin America, I guess. Yeah.
Humanity, at least a good part of them, not all of them, obviously, not Kelly and other places, and Javier Milei. But in that piece, I was just trying to draw, because obviously I didn't have time. The book came out, and it would have been too forced. But if the argument is one of the arguments is that Latin America, from the conquest, the slow abrogation of the doctrine of conquest, and Latin America's ceaseless attempts to get the United States to give up the doctrine of conquest at different moments, and finally doing it in 1933, and that becoming, a general way just to talk about the liberal international order that's put into place, the rules-based order that's put into place in the 1945. In which conquest and wars of aggression are outlawed, in which a nation can only wage war in defense, in which there's a whole slew of international laws that get put in place, not just with the creation of the UN in San Francisco, but over the course over the course of the years that we see, and that was also the creation of what I call, the slow. I was borrowed a phrase, which used in another context, the slow creation of humanity, which was always only fitfully applied. It was a very fragile idea that beyond tribalism, beyond nationalism, that all human beings are one, that we form one community, and a presumption of equality. And so the argument in this piece is that obviously it's not just Gaza. The Cold War played its role, neoliberalism played its role, and this dislocation of economic, globalization. But we do, but up until recently, there still was the premise that the foundation of the international order should be cooperation, that the world had shared interests. I think what Trump represents in his almost comic rhetoric about Canada and Greenland and whatnot, and what in more fearsome terms is seen in Gaza is the end of that. There is that we are being slowly tutored that competition is now the order of the new world, and the doctrine of conquest is clearly back on a full scale in Gaza. And with it comes not the creation of humanity, but as we watch the horror of Gaza in real time, is the dissolution of an unraveling of humanity. I don't know what's going to come in its place. I mean, the lesson learned from the book is that these things, there's long secular trends, like these critiques that Las Casas and Montesinos and Vitoria applied to the Spanish conquest in the 1500s don't have effect, until centuries later in some ways, and that's when. So I mean, I don't know what the backlash is going to be. There was a part of that essay that I cut out because it was getting too long, is that yes, the Spanish conquest and Gaza occurred in the wake of two different communication revolutions. The first one being, of course, the printing press in the 1500s, and now social media. And I mentioned that in the piece, but I had developed it a little bit more, but I cut it out. That the printing press leads to a kind of cohesion of the individual and individuality and a sense of self, whether it being people telling these heroic tales of being warriors in the new world, but certain ways in which printing and the emergence of literacy and the emergence of writing create a sense of agency and self, and it's all part of the slow creation of humanity. The social media revolution that we're living through now, to me at least, seems like a corrosion of the self and individuality. I mean, the AI slop, the deep fakes, the social media, it's concurrent with the larger argument that from the conquest to Gaza marks a certain kind of arc that one can trace regarding the rise, fall, and return of the doctrine of conquest. I think that the two different media revolutions have some bearing in that progress.
There have been a number of things that have happened since your book came out that seem very relevant to your book. But I think I want to focus on one. How did you choose the new Pope, Greg? How did you manage to get them to choose a pope who like embodies in some way
Yeah.
your book? How did you manage to do that?
No, it's well. The thing is, I had to end with Leo. I mean, I had to end with Francis to some
Francis.
degree because I go through liberation theology. I mean, the book goes through a lot of stuff, but the last section is about the killing of Jorge Gaitan in 1948 and using that murder. We don't have time to talk about this, but the book in some ways is a chronicle of a death foretold, and that's Jorge Gaitan, a populist leader in Colombia who was executed, leads to a week of riots, and it kicks off decades of civil war in Colombia. But also everybody was there. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was there, Fidel Castro was there, George Marshall was there, because they were founding the OAS. Camilo Torres, one of the founders of what came to be known as liberation theology, was there. So I used that death as a way to trace the different lines, the economic lines, the national security lines, the liberation theology lines.
It's one of the most brilliant chapters in the book. It's
that
incredible.
Flow out of that. And the fact that nobody really the death is a mystery. It's a conspiracy. Everybody, Colombians don't necessarily live in the wake of the killing of Gaitan. They live in the present of nonstop conspiracy theories of Gaitan, much like us and JFK. It's almost a condition of modernity that you have to have some leader who embodied hope, executed in murky circumstances with the idea that things would have been better if he had lived. That's Colombia. But the point is, I use that death to trace out different lines, and one of them is liberation theology. And I end with Francis, in different ways, because I came back to De las Casas at the end. And yes, and the fact that Pope Leo in some ways seems to be continuing Francis's critique. He seems to be on the right side, that is the left side of the schism within the Catholic Church that is real. The fact that there is the complete collapse of moral authority among leaders has led to a worldwide obsession with the Catholic Church and the Pope, even among people who aren't Catholics, because it seems to be the only kind of secure place, and it's what the Church wants to be. It wants to be the center because it is the institution. It's the institution that has been there from the beginning. And
but he's also like the hemispheric pope, right?
And he's the hemispheric pope
because he's from Peru, he's from Haiti, he's from New Orleans.
He lived in Peru. Yes, he's deeply immersed in all of that. And yes, I would like to get a copy. I asked my publicist, how can we get a copy to the Vatican? The book. He couldn't come up with any ideas. I don't know if anybody out there knows how we can get a copy to Pope Leo. and as soon as I heard Leo the 14th, I knew immediately it was a reference to Leo the 13th and Rerum Novarum, the 1891 encyclical. That was the first. It was a critique of industrial it was a critique of socialism, but it was also a critique of industrial capitalism, and Pope Leo confirmed that, and means to apply it to artificial intelligence and the threat that AI represents. But Rerum Novarum was very influential in Latin America. I mean, Rerum Novarum was a big influence of Perón in Argentina and the expansion of social rights. Pope Francis grew up in Perón's Argentina and absorbed that moment in which the working class and poor people were demanding a say within the public sphere. Then Pope Francis lived through the Cold War political terror. Unclear where he stood. Some people think that the rest of his life he meant to atone for some actions he took or didn't take. But then he ends up in the Vatican, and now we have Pope Leo the 14th, who represents Pope Leo the 13th. So we've gone from Pope Leo the 13th to Perón to Francis to Pope Leo the 14th. There's a kind of nice circularity there.
And I think it's I mean, I do feel hopeful about Pope Leo. I think a lot of people do. Myself, as a non-Catholic who has not actually cared that much about the Catholic Church, you just explained to me why. I now do, because at least there's one world leader who seems, authoritative, credible, and somehow
Well, it's not the
concerned.
Democratic Party. It's not the U.S. I mean, Europe is a mess. I mean, what are the UN is delegitimated for for all sorts of reasons. It seems people on that, it seems like there is this hope invested in Leo, and a huge sigh of relief by some sectors of his selection. I mean, the conservatives who are on the right side of the schism within the Catholic Church feel like the usurpers are, the pretenders are still in power, and I don't think it's going to be long before they start to delegitimate him, like they tried to do Francis. I mean, Francis, one of the things that Francis did, one of the first things he did when he was Vatican was he convened a conclave of Native Americans from the Amazon to come talk and talk about questions of sovereignty and the environment. They planted a tree. They had their faces painted. They were in indigenous dress. They said a prayer to Pachamama, which is the Andean earth name for the earth goddess. And that event, more than anything else, freaked out. It was as if De las Casas had floated a boat full of like Aztec priests and Mayan priests over to debate issues of sovereignty and dominion with the Pope at the time. And I mean, Mel Gibson was on Joe Rogan right before Francis's death, going on about Pachamama. They celebrated the Pachamama god. I mean, it was like as if they were devil worshiping within the Vatican.
Wow. Greg, I think we're at the end of our time. And I just want to say thank you again for this book. I think it's such a necessary moment for all of us to take a step back and look at these much longer historical cycles that you've been sharing with us in some detail in this conversation, and to try and see things. I mean, even as we have this relentlessly narcissistic present moment, what I say right now is the only reality and nothing else ever mattered, person who seems to be just everywhere, affecting everything. I think that it's more important than ever to have studies like this, books like this. And I'm so grateful for this one.
Well, thank you, Esther. Thank you so much.
It's really been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it's really been wonderful talking to you. It's been really lovely, and thank you for everybody at Haymarket Books for organizing this. I mean, they're so generous. It's not even their book, and they
solidarity.
Yeah.
So, and thank you also to everyone who tuned in. Buy Greg's book. That's all I could tell you. Just do it.
Buy the book. Buy the book.
Put it back on the bestseller list. It deserves to be there.
That would be great.
All right. Thanks you so much.
Thanks.